Welcome everybody. Ironically, on a day when we're here to discuss business ethics and the COVID vaccine, the Warden of Trinity College, Professor Ken Hinchcliffe, who would normally be here to introduce and welcome you all, has come down with COVID. So there's a bit of... So here I am coming off the bench as the medical sub. I'm Scott Charles. I'm the Deputy Warden at Trinity College, and thank you very much for coming today. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we all meet on this afternoon, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and if there's any First Nations people joining us today, to pay my respects to them as well. I'd also like to pay our respects to the Gourlay family, because we've had such a wonderful week this week of panels, Q&As, hypotheticals, lectures, and that has all been made possible by a wonderful gift from the Gourlay family back in 2004, which allowed us to bring visiting professors from overseas who had expertise in business ethics, and each year we've been bringing one of those over, and this year, in our 150th anniversary of the college, we decided we'd extend an invitation to all of the professors who'd been here before, and many of them have actually joined us for this wonderful week. And without the Gourlay support, that wouldn't have happened. So I also want to thank very much the Gourlay family for their support there. Thanks. Now, I know it's a bit of a throwaway line to say this person needs no introduction, but it's actually quite true when we come to the person who's going to moderate for us today, which is John Fain. John's been sort of coming to us on our airways with his dulcet tones for over 20 years on the ABC, so we're very lucky to have John. Before joining the ABC in 1989 to host the Law Report on Radio National, John had practiced for 7 years in both commercial litigation and as a legal aid and a human rights advocate. John is the Vice-Chancellor Fellow of the University of Melbourne for 22 and 23, attached to the Melbourne Law School, but with roving commission across the entire university. And as I've just learnt before, and as many of you would know if you've listened to his programs, he's a mad car fan, and Citroens in particular. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Scott. And I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects. And I'd also like, on a personal note, to express my personal impatience for a treaty or treaties which might go some way towards repairing just a bit of the damage that has been sustained since the arrival of white settlers in this extraordinary continent that we all live in. And we'll see the election outcome last Saturday suggests firmly, in fact confirms, that it won't just be state Labor governments that proceed down this path and have already announced that they're doing so, but it'll be done federally as well. And I regard that as a significant step forward for this nation, without which I also believe we're somewhat stuck. But congratulations to Trinity College and the Gourlay Ethics in Business series, and Ali Moore over here has been briefing me on how wonderful the sessions have been, and in her capable hands I've got no doubt whatsoever that they'll be talked about for a long time to come. This final session is almost oxymoronic, to talk about ethics and international pharmaceutical companies. It sort of lights up like a box of fireworks, doesn't it? And we'll see how many fireworks are let off on this panel today, who have been particularly chosen and have been invited to be provocative. So I hope this panel is not just a normal recitation of positions that have been much explored. Instead, what we hope to do, and with your participation when we get to the Q&A in a little while, we hope to just push the boundaries a little bit. It's a cliche to say that COVID years are like dog years, and they have been. And in this city, more than any other, we have, every single one of us, endured something that was beyond our imaginations just a few years ago. It's left scar tissue on every single one of us, in the millions of people who live in Melbourne. It's left scar tissue around Australia and around the world, but particularly so here. And it's going to take a long time for us, I'm sure, to work out exactly what it all means. what it means for working from home versus going to the office, what it means therefore for infrastructure. Public transport planning has been completely thrown up in the air. Purchasing of cars has changed. Scooters, bicycles, mobility, shopping, every aspect of our lives, education, needless to say, healthcare, which we'll talk about today. Everything is different. But something that undoubtedly never changes is the difference between right and wrong. And that's what ethics are about. And in practice, in healthcare, and in the rollout of vaccines and pharmaceuticals, let's see where our distinguished panel take us today. I'm not going to read out lengthy bios. Every one of them are here because they have an extraordinary professional and personal history. You can quickly find out more about them. Just Google it, mate. Which I think is the standout line of our election campaign, is it not? There were not many memorable lines from 3 years of Scott Morrison's Prime Ministership. Some very forgettable, but let's not talk about that, I'll get distracted. But Jeremy Moon, Andrew Cuthbertson, Margie Danchin, Barbara McPake and Norman Swan. And Norman and I go back a very long way, but we'll go through one by one. We'll hear each of them for a few minutes. I'll ask them a few questions. Then, when we've heard from everyone, we'll get them talking to each other, and then we'll invite you to join in the conversation. There'll be 2 roving microphones. Just give me a wave. I'll try and direct the traffic. We've got plenty of time. We'll get through all your questions. Jeremy Moon is Professor of Sustainability Governance from the Copenhagen Business School Sustainability Centre. He's our first speaker today, and Jeremy, thank you very much for setting the scene. Your time starts now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to engaging and listening to the panel and to everybody else. Very briefly, what I want to focus on is how hard times make us re-examine, in this case, the responsibilities of corporations. And I want to give you a short tour through some of my brief researches in this area to suggest to you that we need to be thinking much more about corporations and their social responsibility, and if you like, their social purpose. We are in hard times. What sort of corporations should be making and delivering vaccines? Manifestly, governments have responsibilities for framing the context, making rules, selecting providers. But still, what sort of corporations do we want? I live in Denmark, and one of the corporations I work quite closely with is called Novo Nordisk. It actually doesn't do vaccines for COVID, but insulin vaccines. But it's a very interesting company. It has a stakeholder map, most businesses do. At the centre is not the corporation. Society is the centre of their stakeholder map. And they try to make sense and develop strategies for themselves, obviously, but in relation to that hub of their world, society. And they see their business. They mainly sell to governments and health authorities. So you might say, well, of course, they would say that, wouldn't they? They're also expensive and criticised publicly by President Trump. But they actually offer a much wider service than simply putting the vaccines in the hospital. Astrazeneca, a company which, for reasons of regulation and subsidy, has, along with others, decided not to make selling COVID vaccines an explicit for-profit activity. No additional profits to be gained. Also true of Johnson & Johnson, which operates in a more liberal economy, as you know. Now, look at their purpose. Patients and society. That's how they describe their purpose. Pfizer, a company that's done a good job in creating vaccines, I don't doubt that, but I'm not an expert, its profits increased in 2021 by 3 times. This was despite having tax breaks for the delivery of the service. They have an interesting corporate stated purpose. We want to serve the world, but in so doing, serve our investors. I mentioned before that governments are often critical to the way corporations play out their responsibilities, and that's manifestly the case in Denmark, if anybody wants to come back to that. Going to the UK, which I follow closely despite not living there, it's a sad state at the moment in many ways. A couple of years ago, there was a House of Commons inquiry into the preparedness of the government for an epidemic. It was a parlous story that the report gave. The government ignored the story. manifestly ill-prepared. So as a result, there's a huge scramble for personal protective equipment, test kits. Rascals got the jobs. The anti-fraud squad already is suspicious of 10% of the PPE contracts. Indecent brokerage fees, individuals and consultancies won eye-watering sums for half a day's work. So again, you ask, social purpose. The job subsidies, in many countries we've seen that governments have extended job subsidies for companies to keep employees on the books, keep them ticking over. In many countries, these companies have made more money in this period than in others. One very rarely hears of action to return the funds. I hope that we will hear more about this. I gather in Australia there's a discussion about requiring this for the stock exchange companies. But yet more widely, I studied Bangladesh in some of my other time, and I've been interested in the apparel supply chain. And many Western companies have presented themselves as being able to help improve working conditions and secure worker rights in a country where these are desperately needed. COVID comes. What do we do? We've got all these orders. We've ordered clothes for in the fast fashion, it's not so many months, but maybe up to a year. The suppliers in Bangladesh have workers. They've already paid for raw materials and machinery from China to come in. Most companies simply cancelled contracts and claimed force majeure. One stood out, a Swedish company, H&M. Again, from a different setting, but I think it's instructive that in 2021 they combined their annual report and their sustainability report. They said these things are indistinguishable. And the Association of the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers has described H&M as a strategic partner of Bangladesh. That's a real social commitment, and it's not even their own country. And again, they've taken orders from the start, and they've also paid for maintained orders where the raw materials have been supplied, even if the clothes weren't made. For the rest, well, let's congratulate those who are embarrassed. There was a social movement campaign called Pay Up, and that did embarrass some of them, some of those who had made prior commitments. So companies like Gap have gone back and started resuming taking the orders. Companies like Primark and Levi Strauss are actually also paying for enabling the suppliers to pay their workers during the low time. But still a parlour story. Now, obviously, there are very difficult choices that companies have to make. Their own employees, the supply workers who don't have contractual relationships, their investors. Some companies increase their dividend in this period to their investors. Obviously, I'm not saying this is simple, but H&M, I think, sets a very good example reflecting their interest in sustainability and society.
After World Wars I and II, there was a phenomenon much remarked upon where industrialists were regarded as having had a good war. Are you saying that there are corporations that have had a good pandemic?
Manifestly. And also, not even corporations, sadly, small entrepreneurs, small-scale entrepreneurs.
Implicit in that observation is that you think that's inappropriate. Given the amounts of capital risked to develop a vaccine, the amount of extra work that's done to deal with the challenges of distributing everything from PPE to whatever else was needed, you must acknowledge that people are entitled to some reward in return for their efforts.
Entirely. I'm the last person to say businesses shouldn't be rewarded for doing good, being good companies. They certainly should. There are times when one might temper one's appetite for being able to pay dividends, and when some of these companies have simply said we won't take more than we need. And that in hard times, particularly those companies who talk about their social responsibility, this is a good time to demonstrate it.
Russia and China developed their own domestic supply of vaccines according to quite different processes. We've got experts here, I'm not going to pretend to be one of them. My understanding, though, in very brief summaries, is that they were far less effective than the ones developed by the greedy capitalists, if I can use the cliche.
I'm sure that some of the companies I've named are excellent at their job. Why are they imposing a tax on society at the very time when the treasuries need more money to maintain more disadvantaged people, let alone help in Bangladesh?
All right, and the naming and shaming, we tried a bit of it here. There was a steady campaign. In fact, just last Friday before the election campaign, it was revealed how much money some of the elite private schools had scooped up from JobKeeper, and that disclosure earlier on was revealing that some of our biggest retailers, Harvey Norman in particular, and Solly Lou's empire of clothing companies, had magnificently benefited from JobKeeper, and a fraction of what was assessed to have been overpaid, only a fraction of it was refunded by Harvey Norman, and not a cent was refunded by Solly Lou's empire. So if naming and shaming doesn't work, you can't retrospectively scoop up money that was paid in accordance with rules and law. There was nothing illegal about it, so what else do you do?
Are you asking me, should these companies sit on the money that they've been given, which they don't need?
You can't, can you, well, how do you can't, well, if you want to compel them to pay it back, you have to legislate retrospectively, and we have a strict prohibition, well, not entirely, but almost always in doing so.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Actually, when Starbucks was found not to have paid any corporate taxation in the United Kingdom in 2015, they did offer to make a donation, which was politely declined. But I think companies like this are actually quite good at philanthropic activities, and I think they can perhaps divert some of those funds to that cause.
There's a couple of levers that can be used, just finally on this. I mean, government procurement policies can be skewed towards companies that do the right thing and away from companies that refuse to. What would happen if government said, well, Jerry Harvey, until you pay back that money, we're not buying anything from you?
And I think it's another of my themes, don't get me started, that governments are able to encourage corporations that have a disposition in this way, and they make choices about environmentally sound timber purchases, or in buying from companies which deploy certain employment practices. So this could certainly be extended.
We'll come back to you soon, Jeremy. Thank you. Second up is Associate Professor Margie Danchin, Consultant Paediatrician at the Royal Children's Hospital and Clinician Scientist here in Melbourne, at the University of Melbourne and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and she leads the Vaccine Uptake Group, the MCRI, and she has just come from ward rounds. Margie.
Thanks so much, John. So I think really never before have we had to consider a vaccine rollout across our whole population like we have, in the last 18 months. It's been quite extraordinary. And I think it has posed a lot of ethical questions along the way, and I'm going to touch on a couple of those. When we think about uptake in the population, the barriers are mostly, twofold. One is sort of practical barriers, access, but they are real for many groups in the population and should not be overlooked. And then there are acceptance barriers, vaccine hesitancy. And many people, including the media particularly, frame all of under-vaccination as just vaccine hesitancy when it's not. And I think that's a really important point. But ethically, what have been the biggest ethical challenges? And I think that really comes down to trying to achieve high vaccine coverage. Governments have turned to vaccine mandates. And mandates have been used, certainly in Australia, like never before. We've seen vaccine mandates for flu vaccines, for example, for healthcare workers. But here in Victoria, we had sweeping vaccine mandates that were brought in for healthcare workers, all essential workers, as well as in the education sector. And, I just really want to ask you to stop and pause and think about vaccine mandates. And I think of them as a big stick. And in fact, what the harm and the loss of trust in governments that they can cause and in healthcare providers. So, for example, if you're a pregnant woman and you're working in a hospital or you're a teacher and you are mandated to have a COVID vaccine in pregnancy that has far less vaccine safety data than the other vaccines that are used in pregnancy, I'm a strong proponent for maternal immunisation. But I don't feel that we should have mandated the COVID vaccines in pregnancy. And I was working with the government at the time, and I said I didn't feel that was appropriate, that pregnant women should at least be able to choose. They shouldn't lose their job as a teacher or as a nurse in the ICU if they didn't want to vaccinate whilst pregnant. And, the answer was no. Everyone was mandated, including pregnant women. So I think we need to really step back and look at these really important ethical questions and how do we tackle them? Who stands up and says, hang on, actually I think that person should be allowed to have leave of absence and be paid, have their baby and go back to work. Is that appropriate to mandate vaccination for that group, for example? So I won't go on about mandates, but I think there are lots of ethical questions about the use of mandates. We know that there are sort of key essential criteria that should be satisfied before a mandate is introduced, and that is that the burden of disease in the population needs to warrant it, that it needs to prevent transmission, which has been really tricky with these vaccines because they don't prevent transmission that well. There needs to be adequate safety and effectiveness data and good supply and access. But most importantly, people need to have been given the opportunity to have a vaccine. And these mandates were brought in before many people even had an opportunity to willingly accept the vaccine. Again, really posing important ethical questions. So that's the one big point I want to ask you to think about. The second is vaccine equity, and we've been hearing about supply, manufacturing capacity in many countries, but I ask you to stop and pause and think about a lot of the low and middle income countries. So in Australia, we have over 95% of our adult population over 16 have had 2 doses of a COVID vaccine. There are still many countries globally, in low and middle income countries, that have less than 10% of their population have had 2 doses of a COVID vaccine. And where is that okay? How, we've had COVAX and other, facilities that have been set up to try and have tiered pricing and have access to vaccines for resource-poor countries. But really, is that okay? I think ethically we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we're talking about 4th doses, 2nd booster doses, when there are countries that have really barely begun to vaccinate their high-risk population? And I think ethically that's a huge issue, and I think that we all need to take it on, we all need to own it, and stop being so greedy about the supply that we have. And when you're talking about manufacturing, I think we need to be talking about how we can build capacity in a lot of these low and middle income settings. So they're the 2 big ethical questions I would pose related to COVID vaccines.
Wow, where do we start? Vaccine equity sounds like a great idea. We don't have any other form of equity between first world, second world, third world, poor countries, rich countries, poor people, rich people. Why should vaccines be different?
Well, I think, this really comes back to the question of, morals and global public health, and, that we need to, it really asks us to question who we are and that we want to do good. And I think that is the principle. And, with this global pandemic, we are all impacted by this virus. And in fact, you could argue that by, turning our backs on a lot of these low and middle income countries and allowing the vaccine to run wild and have uncontrolled community transmission, that's how the next variant occurs. That's exactly what happens. So in fact, if you want to be selfish, by not looking after these countries, we are actually negatively impacting ourselves anyway. But that is not the view that I take. I think we have a moral obligation to make sure that we have vaccine equity, and our governments need to actually live that rather than just say it. Because, we've even struggled to give adequate supply in the Western Pacific region to our neighbours, and I think, Norman's spoken a lot about this at various times in his, interaction with the media and so on and on radio. But I think it is a critical issue.
Oh, there's no doubt it is, but what are the answers is the question. Now, we, even domestically within our own community, without looking beyond, we have people who have been, in my view, saboteurs. What would you do about them? They're not vaccine hesitant. They're just plain deniers. What do you do about them?
So you're talking about the vaccine refusers here.
Totally.
Absolutely. So they are...
They've got caves in the hills stashed with water bottles and bullets.
And baked beans.
Yeah.
Well, I'm here to tell you that I work in the immunisation clinic up the road at the Royal Children's Hospital every Tuesday morning, and so I speak with anti-vax parents every week. So I've been doing this for 20 years. And sadly, I'm incredibly respectful. I provide the information and the answers to their questions where I can. I keep the door open, but I keep that conversation pretty short, because I can tell you it is really hard to change the mind of an entrenched anti-vaxxer. And in fact, I'll share another thing with you. My younger sister, who's 7 years younger than me, is an anti-vaxxer, and she lives in Mullumbimby. So I live this, given my role...
Why are you laughing about Mullumbimby anti-vaxxers?
Well, where else would she live, right? But that is the icing on the cake. So I live this from a personal perspective, and she has asked me, it's made me a lot more compassionate. I don't support, obviously, the views of the anti-vaxxers, but attacking them, giving them airtime doesn't help either. So it's about providing information where you can, access to trustworthy sources of information, and then just keeping the conversation short. But, the fence sitters, the big group of people who are hesitant, that's where I concentrate my energies, because you can change their minds, and that's about trust.
Yep. And you change their minds, I think, and I think everyone on this panel, and maybe everyone in the audience, we've all had this conversation with a relative or a neighbour, and it's about respect.
Yep.
Respecting their fear, in my personal experience. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I can sense when a parent opposite me in clinic is engaging or not. And that is about whether they feel that I'm a credible source of information and whether they trust me. And that engagement where you ask people to sort of lower their hackles and that fright and flight response, that's when true vaccine communication happens. And that can, that is something that can work really well. But it is very hard with the anti-vaxxers and the crazy conspiracy theories. I mean, you would not believe what some people come out with, or maybe you would, but very hard to change those people's minds.
Yeah, we're all being manipulated by shape-shifting lizards who live in mountains in Switzerland and control the world, all of that. Leaving that aside, though, we saw from the government's point of view that they decided that pragmatism and uniformity would be more important than anything else. But we saw a complete lack of creativity in the public messaging.
Yep.
I don't want to be overly critical of any individuals, but I think the politicians were the ones in the end calling the shots. And the messaging to the public, I mean, we've seen some brilliant public health messages, and this city and this country has been at the forefront of everything from 0.05 and seat belts, bicycle helmets, over and over again. What went wrong? Smoking, yes, Andrew's saying. What went wrong this time?
Well, I'm ashamed to tell you I sat on the ATAGI COVID vaccine working group that was dedicated to safety and confidence, and so we engaged weekly with the Commonwealth Communications team, who ended up being run by JJ Fruin, an Army general, and that's why you got the Arm Yourself campaign. And it was an absolute disaster. There was no emotion, there was no sense of connecting with people's motivation to vaccinate themselves. And as we know, this virus is tricky. For many people, it doesn't cause severe disease, so focusing the whole campaign on prevention of severe disease just was not resonating. We needed to tap into people's motivation to vaccinate themselves, whether it was to travel, whether it was to visit an elderly grandparent, whether it was for kids to be able to go to school safely. That motivation, we need, and that takes those beautiful campaigns that we saw here in Victoria. The VCOS campaign was beautiful. That broader motivation to vaccinate. We saw some great examples from Singapore and New Zealand and the US.
France was brilliant. Beautiful. One at the cafe. People want to enjoy their lives again. Yep.
We needed to tap into the broader benefits of vaccination, not just prevention of severe disease. And we tried, but at least working with the Victorian State Government, they did a beautiful job. So we had a small win there.
I should declare I made some ads for the Victorian Government.
You did. In fact, I saw them. They are brilliant.
Yeah.
Congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. But then we tried to take the next step, got nowhere. Anyway, Andrew.
Thanks, John. I'm not going to defend the international pharmaceutical industry. I think that's a bridge too far. What I might spend a few minutes talking about from a personal point of view is my experience the last couple of years working at CSL, Securus. When I use the pronoun we at home, I'm often asked, We're talking about CSL, where I've worked for 25 years, or our family. In this case, I'm talking about CSL, okay? So CSL is interesting in its history in that it was begun in 1916, and one of its first big challenges was coping with the flu pandemic of 1919-1920 after the First World War. Was started as part of the recently formed Commonwealth Department of Health, had a wonderful history for 75 years. Government really decided in the 80s that they didn't want to recurrently fund research and development, and so along with Qantas, Commonwealth Bank, Telstra, it was privatised and sold. Quite a lot of the shares were sold to retail mum and dad investors in Australia. And I think that was a good thing, and I will get to the point. It was a good thing because...
It's good for the investors.
It was good for the investors, and it also enabled CSL, whereas when I joined, our R&D investment each year was about 30 million. When I retired recently, it was 1.4 billion a year. And you're able to do that because it's not just looking after Australia, but it has the world as its marketplace. You really can't develop modern vaccines or modern any sort of medicines for a population of 25 million. So I think that's been a success. But and Australia is now about 10% of CSL. It's quite a big company. It's one of the biggest companies on the ASX, still headquartered here, but most of its business is international. But I'm proud to say it's still headquartered here, the board sits here, it's listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So with that background, at the end of January 2020, we had a visit at CSL from a group of wonderful scientists led by Paul Young at the University of Queensland. CSL goes back a long way with UQ because of Gardasil, the HPV vaccine that I was lucky enough to be involved with, and CSL, Merck and University of Queensland, Ian Fraser, over a long time developed Gardasil. I would just say 17 years from when we first started talking about till it was launched. So that just shows you what vaccine development can take. But so we had a visit from Paul Young and his team. They came down at the end of January because they'd announced in the media that they would, that there was this threat emerging of a coronavirus outbreak from China, and that they would...
Everyone, the Staff and Students Sporting event will be starting at 1 o'clock.
Oh. I'll get to the point because we clearly have to finish by 1. The point was they'd announced that they were going to develop a COVID vaccine in 6 months, and then they'd looked at each other and said, shit, how do we do it? So they got on the plane. We had a wonderful meeting. We had a handshake that day that we would help them because, to be clear, in developing new vaccines, there were literally hundreds of novel ideas that came out of wonderful academic science groups in Australia and different parts of the world. Only a very small number made it to clinical trial, and a small number of those were able to be scaled and manufactured to produce the scale and quality needed for late-stage clinical trial testing and then in-market manufacturing. So to cut to the chase, we realised that from Paul Young's description of their technology, that importantly, the facilities and most importantly, the trained staff that CSL had in Australia could develop the UQ vaccine approach. We knew what they meant and how to do it, and we had a handshake that we would join forces and do that. At its peak, we had 300 staff pulled off other things within CSL working on the UQ program. It hit the wall for reasons which are very common in early stage vaccine development. Sadly, and I won't go into it, but sadly it was not because of a safety or efficacy concern. It was due to a a cross-reactivity with the commonly used HIV test, so the program was stopped. And the program was stopped just before we went into a huge international phase 3 clinical trial 2 days before. In the meantime, we had agreed to team up with the Oxford Astrazeneca group. In parallel, we what's called tech transferred that in with a lot of help and collaboration from AstraZeneca into our facilities in Australia, which also matched the ability to make a recombinant adenovirus vaccine. That one did go all the way, and we were able to go into production. And that one was done on a not-for-profit basis. So my summary would be a couple of things. Tremendously important to have onshore at-scale manufacturing of industry resources that can work closely with creative academic scientists at both the development of the vaccine but also the testing and the clinical testing, and we had that. The facilities have to match the technology, so we were able to do UQ and AstraZeneca. At that point, not RNA, which is a different topic. We did, I'll try to control myself, but we did request help to tech transfer RNA during the pandemic and were refused.
Who by?
I'll leave it there, John, but that was disappointing.
Okay. I said before we don't pass retrospective laws, but I have to do a retrospective introduction for Andrew. He was head of R&D and chief scientific officer at CSL for 25 years, now as a non-executive director, is enterprise professor at the University of Melbourne on the University of Melbourne Council. I apologise that I threw to you without explaining to everybody just how distinguished you were. My mistake. Why didn't CSL explain itself better during the pandemic? I tried, as did many other people, to get CSL to engage in the public debate and was told no.
Let me have a go. First of all, it was extremely intense.
Yes.
We're in a very highly regulated... So we had both... We can't do anything without approval of the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
Yep.
And we were being instructed by government, Commonwealth Government, particularly Department of Health, as to what they wanted us to do.
But
we were very focused, John, on trying to do everything they asked us or demanded of us very, very fast.
Yep.
And we didn't want to be distracted from our mission.
Understand that, but you do have public affairs staff. They were itching at the bit, and I know that. And they were told they weren't allowed to speak. Surely it's in Greg Hunt and Brendan Murphy and everybody else's interests to have the preeminent experts who are homegrown, widely respected, highly trusted, utterly authoritative, to join in with the Sharon Lewins or whoever else of this world in engaging with the public and overcoming some of the hesitancy and some of the anxiety.
So you may well be right with hindsight. I guess a couple of other remarks, and maybe you're right, maybe we should have said this at the time, and I know people here understand this, but some of the things that perhaps it would have been better if we'd responded to were statements like, I'll have the vaccine if you can guarantee it's 100% safe.
Yep.
Well, it may be easy for me to say, but it's a very naive perspective, because if you can imagine developing a powerful medical intervention that alters your whole immune system, and you're giving it to an outbred population from kids to 100-year-olds.
Well, no vaccine's 100% safe.
Yeah, so you can never say that, but as you gain more experience of safety and efficacy, you can be incrementally more clear as to, we know what the rare side effects are, and they exist. We know that it might make you feel rotten for a couple of days and have a sore arm. So those things become, as you go from clinical trials into real-world pharmacovigilance, the certainty with which you can turn around and say, it's safe and effective, relatively safe and relatively effective, your confidence grows.
Sure.
But if you're in early stage, you can only rationally report on the data that you have.
And just finally, there's likely to be a judicial inquiry or royal commission or some form of investigation into Australia's COVID response. I say that for two reasons. First of all, I think it's actually a good idea. We need to learn. But secondly, an incoming government will always look to discredit their predecessors, and there's nothing better than an inquiry with specific terms of reference to do so. The questions you've said you're unable to answer today, you may be compelled to answer under oath. Are you prepared? You're quite happy to do so in the appropriate forum?
Look, I think so, John. It's just, I think, the other one, if you want to, of points of controversy, shall we say, for 2 years doing everything requested of CSL from government, trying really, really hard, pulling people off everything else they were doing and so on, there was it's called an approach to market to build an RNA vaccine facility in Australia. The number mentioned, I have no more insight than anyone else, but the number mentions 2 billion to do that. CSL participated in that approach to market, but were ignored in the end. And the government went with a US biotech company, a competitor, which is fine. And I see no value in... Well, I think it's fine from a CSL point of view because CSL's actually been working on RNA vaccines for about 8 years.
Sure. But
And if it makes sense, and we'll take an improved version into clinical testing.
Sure, but we need to move on. But we were talking before with Jeremy about government procurement and the power of government procurement policies. There's an example where they completely missed out.
Well, and my point going back to Jeremy is just that I have no insight into how they got to that outcome.
Well, when I'm appointed to the Royal Commission, I'll call you in and swear you in, and we'll see where we go. Professor Barbara McPake is the Director of the Nossal Institute at the University of Melbourne, former Director of the Institute for International Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, and is our next speaker.
All right, thank you very much. None of my fellow panellists have actually said very much about the behaviour of the pharmaceutical companies that produced the vaccines, and I think there's an acceptance around the table that, of course, it was bad. But I want to talk about exactly how bad and how protected by governments that bad behaviour has been. So that's kind of what I want to say. And I'm going to talk about 3 of the manufacturers in particular. I'm going to talk about Astrazeneca, which, as Jeremy said, is probably one of the better behaved, but there's still quite a lot of question marks about its behaviour in the mix. And I'm going to talk about Pfizer, which has been one of the worst behaved. And I'm also going to talk about Sinovac, because people tend to talk about the Western ones separately and not know very much about what's going on in China. To summarise the behaviour of all the pharmaceutical companies that have produced the main vaccines that we've all had, they've behaved really without much of an ethical compass at all. They've made lots of empty humanitarian and public interest promises that they haven't delivered on. They've profiteered off public investment, and the main upshot of this is that they've left Africa without vaccines, which is a humanitarian and ethical outrage, but it's also to all of our disbenefit that new variants will be emerging from Africa because of the gap that leaves. So let me just say a little bit about those 3. I can say a little bit about Moderna as well. I actually know very little about what's going on with Johnson & Johnson, so don't ask me any questions about Johnson & Johnson. But AstraZeneca, indeed, it's been by far the cheapest vaccine. At its cheapest, it's been about $2 a dose.
Might just pull this.
Oh, sorry, I'm not...
If I can move you
sure,
in a little more.
I'll move.
Apparently people are saying they're struggling to
Okay. So AstraZeneca has probably behaved the best of the 3. It's by far the cheapest vaccine at about $2 a dose at its cheapest. And it has, as Jeremy said, promised not to make profit from the COVID vaccine during the pandemic. But they declared the pandemic over in November last year, just as Omicron was hitting Europe, and therefore that behaviour is not guaranteed into the future at all. Their pricing strategies has been the same as everybody else's pricing strategy, very untransparent and designed to enable to get the maximum willingness to pay out of each country one by one. So, for example, South Africa has been paying twice as much as Europe and Britain for the same vaccine, which I don't believe can be justified ethically. Pfizer is the marker of the worst behaviour of any of the companies. It manufactured an RNA vaccine, as you know, that's the new form of vaccine. A lot of the basic research into RNA vaccines was done in universities with public money. Pfizer then got very substantial investment from the German government to further help it produce that final stage of the actual product. And its vaccine has been the most expensive, and as Jeremy said, its profit margins grew by threefold, from about 10% to about 30%, as a result of the production of the vaccine. It promised that it would give the COVAX facility. John, you were asking earlier on, what is the solution to the problem of distributing vaccines to Africa? The COVAX facility was set up as a mechanism. Many of the vaccine manufacturers promised large quantities of their vaccine to COVAX, and they haven't delivered. So far, I think Pfizer has given less than 1% of its total vaccine production to COVAX, despite promising much more at the beginning. And because of the German government's investment in Pfizer and its interests in Pfizer's profitability, the German government has been one of a few standout governments that have prevented the so-called compulsory licensing of the RNA vaccine formulae, which would have enabled countries like South Africa and India to manufacture their own, and in South Africa's case in particular, to distribute it across Africa. So the German government, along with 2 or 3 other governments, has stood out and prevented that happening. So Pfizer is behind, to a substantial degree, the failure of the distribution of vaccines across Africa, because the other solution is that South Africa can manufacture its own and distribute it, but that's been blocked by the GTO. So as I said, I'd say a couple of things about Sinovac, because I think people know very little about Sinovac. It is a private company. It is a private profiteering company with a history of being fined for bribing government officials. Yes, it's not as good a vaccine. I would say that's not so much because there's some different kind of incentive environment, but because the Chinese were less robust in the way that they regulated the production of the vaccine, and Sinovac was allowed very earlier on to test its vaccine on human subjects before it had gone through what vaccines that were being produced in the West were having to do before that was allowed. And Sinovac has been distributing its vaccines to Africa to a greater extent than the others, but not as a philanthropic gesture. So, for example, Senegal has paid $20 a dose for Sinovac, which tells you something about how it can't get enough Astrazeneca. South Africa was being charged $5 a dose for AstraZeneca, so they're paying more for a worse vaccine. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, so lots of questions. What happened to WHO in the United Nations? Where have they been?
I think
in the commercial. They've been there in terms of the messaging, but in trying to sort out some of these bumps in the pricing.
WHO's history has had it knocked back substantially every time it has challenged commercial interests. So you can go all the way back to the 1970s, when it, for example, produced guidance to avoid the marketing of infant formulae, the essential medicines lists that the Americans in particular saw as being injurious to the interests of its pharmaceutical companies. And as a result, it has been denied the funding that was initially agreed for it in the initial setting up of WHO, not part of Bretton Woods, I don't think, but pretty soon after. So it's easy to blame it for not leading more, but it has been so immiserated, denied resources because it has stood up for what's right against commercial interests in the past that I think it's understandably a little bit feeble about doing it. I'm not saying that makes it okay. No. I think it explains its behaviour, though.
So in the same way we've seen the UN fail with Russia and Ukraine, we've seen the global community fail on emissions standards and enforcement. We've seen them fail on consumer protection. We've seen them fail where asbestos products are still for sale in some countries in the world because there's corruption involved at the local level, but there's no global governance. We've seen unsafe products declared unsafe in first world countries, but still being supplied and sold with no regard for global standards. Well, there are no global standards that can be enforced. We're seeing exactly the same thing happen even when something is obvious, as the life and death issues to do with the vaccine are at stake. What does that mean then when we're told we're a global community? Quite clearly, we're not.
No, absolutely, and I think our governments are letting us down before the UN is letting us down. Our governments are denuded of resources because of the failure to pay taxes. They haven't developed alternative models of how they can be adequately funded, so they've been beholden to commercial interests to engage through public-private partnerships to do things that governments should really be doing with public resources, with public interests only in mind. And I think the story of the vaccines is a rather interesting one from this point of view. When you think about all the publicly funded investment, not just in the final stage product development of, for example, the RNA vaccines, but of all the university research that underpinned the basic work that went into that, they make that available as a public good, which in some way makes a lot of sense. But if they were thinking about models by which they could reap some of the returns on those investments, that might be an alternative to a failed tax system, it seems to me. And yet governments, I don't know whether they don't have the incentives to think about these models, or whether they don't have the initiative, or whether there's something I can't see that makes that impossible. But it seems to me that that's the sort of thing that needs to happen so that governments have more power in the mix of in the mix with commercial interests.
I think that's another whole week of panel
Of course
discussion.
it is, yes.
Our final speaker, and then I invite you to think about your contributions from the floor. I will briefly have the panel speak to each other, but we'll get to your questions soon, and you might want to think about your question, and I'd encourage you to ask a question rather than recite a poem or sing a song. But also I'd encourage you to ask your question of one person, because if you ask the entire panel, that's 5 questions. So if you could address your question to one person, there may be someone else who wants to add something onto their answer, but I'll come to that in just a moment. And our final panellist is Dr. Norman Swan. We were colleagues at the ABC. When I joined the Law Report in 1989, Norman was already a giant in the ABC Radio National constellation. He's a medical and health broadcaster, has hosted the ABC's Coronacast, and is a constant and welcoming presence on television, radio, and now also online. Norman.
Thanks, John. Just to take up a little bit with Barbara there, just clarifying, because you didn't mention Moderna. And I think the money that went into the Pfizer vaccine didn't go to Pfizer, it went to BioNTech, which is the German company that actually developed the vaccine and continues to develop mRNA vaccines. Pfizer actually had a policy not to take public money itself as a marketing organisation, and I think that was to give it running room to do exactly what you just said. That's what. However, Moderna, as a new and young biotech company, took a lot of money, of public money, and they have consistently refused to reduce their prices. They are actually the most expensive vaccine. I don't think it's Pfizer. I think the Moderna pricing is higher, and they have not behaved well globally as a vaccine company. And are the ones who got the contract that Andrew was talking about. I think I'm just going to cherry pick a little bit here rather than going over all territory. I want to come back to Margie's presentation in a minute. I think a core issue for the pharmaceutical industry and for us as consumers and for government, is the issue of public investment. So just extending beyond what Barbara was saying, is that there are people in this room who no doubt donate money to Peter Mac or Children's Hospital or others or research groups for the cure for cancer, treating diabetes, new developments. We all want to see those happening, and that money is not wasted. A lot of research fails, but some succeeds and becomes commercialized. The problem, and it's a global problem, is that, we're sitting here in the Florey Institute. And at this Florey Institute is the person one of the people who discovered the protein that's at the core somehow of Alzheimer's disease. That and a lot of other research has led to drugs which may or may not work in Alzheimer's disease. And the drug companies want to sell it back to us at between $70,000 and $100,000 a year. That happens with cancer drugs, some of which operate on Australian IP. You had a situation not so long ago with a hepatitis C drug, which cost about $80 to produce per course, and the bill was $80,000. And if that had prevailed in the days of the beginning of CSL, when you had to produce polio vaccine, measles vaccine, and other vaccines, we would have unaffordable vaccines because the pharmaceutical industry now argues that they should be paid for the societal value of what they gain from it. So the argument for the 80,000 hepatitis C drug was, we save liver transplants, therefore we deserve to be rewarded. Now, if vaccine companies internationally had done that historically, going back to particularly post-Second World War, we would still have polio epidemics in Australia because we couldn't afford the polio vaccine, because the vaccine company would have charged us for the money saved in children not being in iron lungs. So the fundamental shift has happened ethically within the pharmaceutical industry, where they charge what they can get away with. The average new cancer drug that Peter Mac is using over there and having to pay for, and by the way, some cancer centres internationally are refusing to pay for these drugs and saying, we're just simply not going to use them, is tens of thousands of dollars a year. And the benefits for the people in whom it works are great. But let's say one of these new immunotherapy drugs only work in 1 in 3 people with melanoma. Multiply those tens of thousands of dollars by 3, because that's the true cost of the drug. And so we have a crisis at the moment where we spend a lot of medical research and we don't see the financial benefits of that. The pharmaceutical industry still says it costs $1 billion or more to develop a new drug, when in reality it still costs them a lot of money, by the way, but it's more like 300 or 400 million rather than $1 billion or $2 billion, which is what they say, because they amortize all sorts of other costs here. This is a massive ethical and financial issue, but at its core, we amongst the nations fund medical research. Margie and others would argue rightly, and I would support them, that we don't fund it enough. 13% success rate, I think, last year in the National Health and Medical Research Council. And the 13% that...
8% for fellowships.
So that's not because everybody else is crap. There's a lot of good people around, and a lot of research is falling by the wayside. There's interrupted research, there's discontinuity in research. And yet, we are not seeing the benefit necessarily of that being fed back. The pharmaceutical industry is getting away with it. And they know that the United States is the key market. And there are currently laws in the United States, or at least regulations, which forbid public sector organizations to negotiate on price. And so the pharmaceutical gets high price, and that anchors the price for other markets. So until you see deregulation and market forces at work, these are not market forces. Until you see market forces at work in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, the home of free markets, no free market in pharmaceuticals, then you won't see those prices coming down. and a whole series of other issues around that, of key opinion leaders, people promoting these drugs, wanting to be able to use them, and so on and so forth. It's a massive issue, not just in vaccines, but in cancer. I want to pick up, though, on what Margie was talking about, because what Margie was talking about, and Andrew to some extent as well, but they were being polite about it, is that the core ethical issues around this pandemic, to my mind, have centred on government and how government, particularly the federal government, has behaved. And in my view, they have behaved on several occasions and sometimes fundamentally unethically. You're talking about a pandemic. No textbook of public or population health has to be rewritten because of COVID-19. This pandemic has behaved the way pandemics have for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The way we responded to this pandemic in January, February, March 2020, just read Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, same way. What did Florence do during plague years? It closed its borders, it nailed the poor in their homes. So there's nothing new in this pandemic. It's based on science, deep understanding of science. And yet, you saw variation between governments on their advice. The epidemiologists in Victoria are just as good as the epidemiologists in New South Wales. They're all operating on science, giving the same advice in theory. And when you heard variation, it was politics. It was politics at work. And the public health people knew what needed to be done in this pandemic, and the federal government had to be dragged kicking and screaming with very poor scientific advice on their part, with infectious disease, a group of people in infectious disease who knew a lot about influenza, knew a lot about how to prevent methicillin-resistant staph in hospitals, but not a lot about pandemics. But we had lack of transparency and effectively national secrecy around what should have been science and health, and so we understood the basis of the decision-making, and we got none of that.
Why do you think pharmaceutical companies would behave any differently to property developers, the mining lobby, the resources lobby, any of the other big players in the Australian economy? They're just doing what corporations do.
Well, it comes to the ESG thing that Jeremy was talking about as well, and there was something different about pharmaceutical companies in terms of their ethos many years ago when they were private companies. I mean, CSL is an exception, but they were private companies, they behaved differently. But I think also the purchasing practice of government was different as well. It's very hard for a small country like Australia. We do get good prices, lower prices, but it's anchored in the American market. And the American market has changed, and America has changed.
So many issues that have come up, and Norman has almost gift-wrapped it, tied a ribbon around it, put a bow on and gone, boom, there it is. We're inviting your questions. I've still got lots of questions for all the panel. I'm just very quickly going to run through them all, and then I'm looking for hands. I've got one over there. I'm feeling like the auctioneer on Saturday down the street. We'll come to you in a moment, sir. But I'm quickly going to go through the same order and ask just for a short response, going back to you, Jeremy. Anything that you've heard changed your mind about any of the major themes of what you said?
Well, I've really enjoyed listening. I think on this inequality across the world, it's not just, if you like, the world community. Pharmaceutical companies can price according to different markets. Novo Nordisk does it. It has a lower price for poorer countries. It's been criticised a few times for not doing, and they quickly tried to get their house in order.
Yep.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. It's all right. All right. I didn't mean to stop you. I just wanted to get you to lean into the mic. You done?
That's mine. Thank
Margie?
you.
Yeah, I've wanted to raise the issue, listening to Norman, and also the great comments you made around public trust in vaccine manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies, because for me, as a vaccine researcher who works on implementation of vaccines, trust and confidence in vaccines, I can't work with the pharmaceutical companies because any of my research, if I take any money or funding or I partner, I sit on advisory boards, I immediately lose trust of the public if I'm talking about any of my interventions, my policies, the tools that we're developing. And it's really a conundrum for me because, of course, we need the pharmaceutical companies and the vaccine manufacturers to have the vaccines, but I can't work with them because I damage the trust that the public have in me. And it still remains a huge conflict for me, and I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Before you do, you've given me an idea. We saw that Christian Porter was under siege over allegations on Four Corners, and he was able to launch a legal fund through what was described quite inaccurately as a blind trust. In other words, he claimed he didn't know where the money came from. Would you be able to use the same technique? What if you set up a box between the pharmaceutical companies and the researchers?
Well, that's actually been done.
So and the money, has it?
So the National Asthma Campaign, in theory, is that black box. The pharmaceutical companies all put money into it and they take it out, in theory.
The researchers take it out, so they don't know
well,
where it's
not
from?
researchers, but it's for public information.
For the public campaign. But you could do the same for research,
well,
couldn't
we actually talked about that.
Yeah, to put a shield between the people doing the research and the
because
people...
I've been approached by so many of the companies for me to sit on their boards or build confidence in their vaccine and engage with the implementation and the use of the vaccines, and I've just said no to all of it.
Yep. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yep.
Anyway, Andrew.
I'm not sure I can simply answer Margie's question. I mean, CSL, for example, works with lots of high-quality academic groups around Australia and
I've just
Europe
been asked
and
to
the
sit
US.
on the Securus Advisory Board.
Yep. So Securus is a wholly owned subsidiary of CSL, just so you know. However, it is really clear, as I think Norman said, that in our global system, companies develop and make the vaccine. So at some level, it's actually very important that our leading academic scientists are able to collaborate with the companies. I mean, they have to close that loop. Otherwise, you can have wonderful academic research, but it can't be implemented.
I think the issue is there can't be any money received. So I refuse to accept any money, but I sometimes participate in the advisory boards. But even then, I'm criticised that I'm not objective.
I mean, for example, we, CSL, do quite often what we provide are unique reagents that you can't. They may be candidate vaccines or they may be recombinant antibodies or reagents that don't exist anywhere else, and we provide those. So it's not a cash payment, but it enables our academic colleagues to do experiments and work that they otherwise couldn't do. So, I mean, sometimes those sort of relationships can work.
All right, Barbara?
Yeah. I'm an economist, so I'm not under any illusions about whether or not companies are profit-seeking and whether there's any other potential way of constructing them, although noting Jeremy's really interesting points that he started off with. But the point is that in liberal democracies, we should be expecting our governments to be regulating what is and isn't permitted in that profit-seeking quest, and they're failing to do so. So Norman made some good points correcting me about that Pfizer BioNTech are not the same company, and Pfizer did clearly, deliberately avoid taking American government money, and Moderna took that to the tune of about $8 billion. And then we see that Moderna's behaviour is actually not any more regulated than Pfizer's, so in a sense Pfizer may as well have taken that money if they and had an extra $8 billion in their pocket or whatever they would have got. But in principle, the American government could be regulating Moderna. There's an act, I can't remember its name, that allows it to take specific regulatory measures when it has put substantial amounts of money into the investment of a product. But they don't do it. Now, why don't they do it is a question you'd have to ask them, I suppose. But we can guess why not, and it's not too pretty.
No, it's not. Always follow the money. Yeah. And finally, Norman, before we get to the first question and any others.
I think you should open up.
Okay, certainly. So there's a question over there, gentleman on the aisle with the microphone. Go ahead, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Gourlay, so I'm quite interested in all of this. Question for Barbara is an extension of the mega corporations, Pfizer, Moderna, across to companies like Apple, Amazon, Google and so on. And these corporations are so massive that they push their profits around to different precincts and places that don't have any tax rates, any corporate tax rates. How do you think, and in the context of the UN and the WHO and so on, not having much clout, how do you think we can make them accountable?
Yeah, look, it's clearly not an easy question, or we'd be doing it. But I think on the basis of getting taxes out of them, we need international agreements about taxation, so that you can't have Ireland taking everybody's supposed profits and charging a lower rate of tax. And I think that with some leadership from the biggest countries, I think that could happen. I think Ireland could be bullied out of its behaviour, probably.
They are being. There is progress on international treaties, and there's I think it's called the consolidation or something. I've forgotten the exact term, but there is a regime at the moment for the regularisation and the obliteration of some of these tax havens. There'll always be one that slips through.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, and then the other, the point I was making earlier about maybe governments need to get a bit smarter about not relying wholly on tax. Yep.
Because there's always a way of avoiding that. Anyone else? Any more questions for our panel? Ali Moore has got one. Gentleman, their hand in the middle. I'll come to you next. And then the man on the aisle, and then we'll be about out of time.
I just wanted to ask Margie, actually, and thank you all. Honestly, so many headlines that I could write out of this discussion. I'm really interested in the issue around mandates, and that you sat on that advisory panel and you were not listened to, and you didn't go public. And one of the big things about this was that there was such a desire to get uniformity of view that the rest of us were essentially told, sit back, trust us, we know best. If you want trust, isn't an open and honest conversation and differences of opinion being aired the best way to go?
I can't agree more, and it's been the most fascinating and challenging thing for me to be working so closely with government across this time, because you want to work in the tent, but you want to be able to speak freely outside the tent, and it's incredibly difficult. So I was sitting on many of those committees. I was, at round tables with the Premier and talking about a lot of these, and I would, air these views. The decision about maternal vaccination and not exempting those women was this public health notion that, well, then you're sending the message to all the other pregnant women that the vaccine is not safe and we want pregnant women to be vaccinated. And of course the vaccine was recommended in pregnancy, but to mandate it when we didn't have as much safety data that we would normally have, I didn't feel was ethical, and I thought those women should have the right to choose. And I was shot down. But no, I didn't go public with that because I felt that I still wanted to work with government and try and do good inside the tent, but still remain objective outside the tent. And I'd love to hear Norman's views on this, because it is still the thing I find the most challenging.
It's hugely challenging. Heads of institute got threatening phone calls to say if they didn't toe the line, they could see their funding at risk. I got a text from a coalition member of Parliament saying, you know that you're solely responsible for vaccine hesitancy in Australia. And that was probably for me the hardest ethical, moral issue of the whole pandemic, was this issue of clots being reported in Europe. And you had the head of the TGA and ATAGI saying, this is not a problem, this is just a minor little issue, there's no biological plausibility. In the early days, Finland had worked out the incidence of this problem, and they've never been contradicted. And I don't know how they did it, within 2 weeks, they knew what the incidence of this clotting problem. It was a very unusual clotting problem. It was getting international headlines. These were not countries without major public health infrastructure with really good researchers. The German researcher who'd pioneered that had worked out what the mechanism was. I was at a clinical meeting, and one of the senior people, members of ATAGI, was there, still arguing there was no biological plausibility. when there was. And so the problem that you had as a journalist in this case was, is this war and I'm just happy to go with the propaganda, or is trust the most important element here? And I went with trust.
Hi, I'm Rob Phillips. I'm one of the Gourlay visiting professors, and forgive me if this is two questions for Margie and Norman. We are reminded that there are other vaccines in the world, HPV, influenza. Some of them are obligatory, some of them are not, some of them are mandatory. How should we think about the difference? What are the differences and similarities among the vaccines that would inform the extent to which we should make any one of them mandatory, either from public policy or messaging?
Well, I sort of went through those 6 essential criteria before a vaccine should be mandated. But the most important thing is to mandate a vaccine, it's because you can impact, you're going to potentially transmit the infection to others. You can't mandate a vaccine for personal protection alone. That is your decision. Okay, but so for influenza or for COVID, if you go to work and you have COVID and you infect other people, then that is when the mandate becomes, a critical issue, that you have to have the vaccine to protect other people. And then there's all those other things I talked about, ensuring access and supply, safety, effectiveness, the burden of disease, and of course that people have at least some opportunity of free will to accept the vaccine. But yeah, you can choose to get sick and die, and that was not well appreciated.
But the problem then is, can you choose for your children to be sick or die? And we don't even mandate for children, but we just have carrots and sticks, which make it which really kind of funnel parents down into getting that. And as Margie said, most parents who don't get the kids vaccinated is because they've got 2 jobs, it's busy, they can't get to the doctor, it's inconvenient. We don't make it as easy as it should be to get these vaccines, but we make it hard on parents not to make a decision not to get vaccinated. So we don't even mandate for children. I think mandating is really tough. In a pandemic, when you're sure you've got a sterilising vaccine, which had pretty good sterilising vaccines for the early variants, but now there's no argument for mandating because they don't protect against infection.
But can you imagine where we would be if we hadn't mandated?
I think the mandates were brought in at a time where it was reasonable to consider them, but the consultation with certain groups and the opportunity for people to freely access them and overcoming the access barriers first were not done well. So there were people in different cultural groups with health literacy barriers who couldn't actually access the vaccine, but they were being penalised, they were losing their job. So I think mandates absolutely have a role, don't get me wrong, and they're incredibly effective, but they come at a cost and they cause harm.
And part of that cost was support for Clive Palmer. That's part of that political reaction.
It's a hell of a price. I've got hands going up everywhere, but we're just about out of time. There's a gentleman with a lavish moustache here on the aisle.
Michael Segan, retired business academic. My question is for Jeremy. The decisions made by the executives and the managers in Moderna, Pfizer, Astrazeneca, their issues were a moral business one rather than the medical one. My question is, are we doing enough in business schools to actually educate our future managers about business ethics and the moral dimension to the decisions that they take?
Well, that's an interesting question for me. There's a lot of business schools which are doing much better, but I was at a meeting not so very far from here in a business school, and the MBA students were saying we don't have anything on sustainability in our programme. So that was sad to hear. I should say that evening I went to a meeting of the leadership of that school, and I heard about initiatives which sound propitious, but I think we could do more. My own personal point would always be that corporations also need to learn more about how to collaborate in some of these issues with each other, to respond to social regulation, and to help governments regulate better. And that sounds weird because in many ways, obviously, there are anxieties about that. But coming from Denmark, as I do now, I see this, and governments approaching regulation of corporations gently to help them, and then governments encouraging certain responsible behaviour, be it reporting, due diligence, transparency of various sorts. I could go on, but thank you for the question.
I think it was hitting a sweet spot, there's little doubt about that. I'm sorry, but there's still plenty of hands going up, but we are out of time. Our panel have been wonderful, it's been thought-provoking, it's ticked every box that we wanted to achieve in discussing ethics in business during the pandemic. And congratulations again to Gourlay and to everybody involved at Trinity College for the whole series, but particularly for today. Scott Charles will finish off in just a moment, but a final word from me. Deregulation has been the fast track to political success for some of our most ambitious politicians in the last decade. And deregulation might have guaranteed their success personally, but it's my personal view that it's been a disaster for our economy, our society, our health system, and undoubtedly for a lot of individuals. It's led to some tragic outcomes, the likes of which I don't know that we'll ever see again. And the sooner we rethink the abolition of red tape, willy-nilly to advance individual political careers, the sooner we do that, the better, whether it leads to re-regulation or a better balance. The pendulum has swung and it's gone too far and it has to come back. The purpose of regulation is not to enrich the shareholders of corporations. It's to protect the community from what otherwise is not checked. And the sooner we do it across the board, whether we're talking about products or whether we're talking about pharmaceuticals, whether we're talking about cars, it doesn't matter what, over and over again, it's been a disaster. This session has been thought-provoking. I thank you all, but Scott's going to finish off, and thank you all for listening and asking such terrific questions. Scott.
What an absolute treat that was when we have a panel who are prepared to sort of share their opinions, their experience, their knowledge of facts. It's just wonderful. And picking up on your question there, that's right. If the business schools aren't doing it, that's really one of the reasons which John Gourlay decided he would actually have this very set of visiting professors in business ethics, so that we did think about it and so that we had these conversations and so that we all thought about it, and perhaps some improvement will come out of it. I think you've summed it up really well, John. I'm not going to even attempt to sort of make a summary of anything. Thank you so much. Absolutely wonderful. And once again, thank you.